Welcome to Life Stories, where every journey holds a lesson, and every setback leads to growth. Today, we follow the story of Jackson Davis, a once successful businessman who finds himself on the brink of ruin. With a company crumbling under the weight of betrayal and financial deceit, Jackson's life seems to be falling apart. But a chance encounter with an unlikely ally, Emily Parker, sets him on a path of redemption. Will he be able to rebuild his life, restore his company, and make amends for his past mistakes? Stay tuned to find out. Subscribe to Life Stories and begin the journey with us today. Jackson Davis sat in his office, the weight of his failing business pressing down on him with a suffocating force. The walls of the room, once filled with the hum of success, now seemed too quiet, too empty. His large oak desk, scattered with papers and legal documents, seemed like a reminder of everything he had lost. The sleek glass window overlooked the city, the skyline a cold reminder of how far he had fallen from the heights of his former life. The once coveted corner office, where he had dreamed of grand deals and successful ventures, felt more like a prison now. Across from him sat Greg Lawson, his lawyer, a man who had been with him through thick and thin. Someone Jackson had trusted for years. Yet, in this moment, trust felt like a fragile thread, one that was about to snap. Greg's face was stoic, but Jackson could see the unease in his eyes. He knew the gravity of the situation. The company, once a thriving empire, was now teetering on the edge of collapse, drowning in debt with no lifeline in sight. "Jackson, I've been through everything we could possibly do," Greg said, his voice low but firm, as he shifted through a stack of papers. "We've exhausted all our options. Legal recourse, investors, restructuring, the creditors are circling. There's nothing more we can do. I'm sorry." The words hit Jackson like a slap in the face. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together, trying to find the strength to respond. It was as if the room itself was closing in on him. He had worked so hard to build this company from the ground up, pouring his soul into it, believing in its potential. Now, it was all slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Is this it, then?" Jackson's voice was barely a whisper, but the desperation in it was undeniable. "Is this the end?" Greg sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking at Jackson with pity. "We've done all we can. The assets aren't there to attract serious investors. We're too far gone." His eyes softened, but the harsh truth lingered in the air like a heavy fog. "It's over, Jackson." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jackson stared at the papers on his desk, the numbers and figures that once represented promise now mocking him. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but the words wouldn't come. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. He had given everything to this company, and now it was crumbling before his eyes. The door to the office cracked open, and his secretary, Clara, poked her head inside. She had been with him for years, a constant presence through the ups and downs. Her face was filled with concern, but she didn't dare say anything. She knew Jackson was at the end of his rope, and the last thing he needed was more pity. "Mr. Davis, is everything okay?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jackson turned to look at her, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and despair. "No, Clara," he snapped, his voice harsh. "Nothing is okay." He immediately regretted his outburst. But it was too late. The words were out, and the guilt gnawed at him as he saw the hurt in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he muttered, waving her off. "Close the door, please." Clara nodded silently, her face etched with concern as she did as he asked, closing the door quietly behind her. Jackson could feel the weight of her unspoken sympathy, but it only made him feel more isolated, more alone in his failure. The room was suffocating, the air thick with the realization that his empire was collapsing, and there was nothing left to hold onto. Greg stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, ready to leave. "I'll let you know if anything changes, Jackson," he said, his tone businesslike, but Jackson could sense the finality in it. There was no more hope to offer. Jackson didn't move as Greg packed up his papers. gathering his things as if they were just another case. Another client. But to Jackson, this wasn't just another case. This was his life, his dream, slipping away. "Thank you, Greg," Jackson said, standing up slowly, his voice raw. I appreciate everything." Greg nodded, his eyes softening for just a moment before he turned to leave. "If you find a way out, let me know. I'll be here," he said, his voice tinged with an unspoken sadness. And with that, he left, leaving Jackson to his thoughts. Jackson sat back down at his desk, his head in his hands. How had it come to this? How had everything gone so wrong? He had been so careful, so meticulous in every decision, every deal, and yet, here he was, at the end of it all, his world crumbling around him. He stood up, unable to sit still any longer. Grabbing his coat from the back of his chair, he walked toward the door, pausing only to glance at Clara's desk. She was busy with something, but Jackson didn't have the energy to engage her in conversation. He simply walked out, his mind clouded with thoughts of what came next. The wind outside was biting, but it barely registered as he walked to his car. He started the engine and drove aimlessly, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The streets blurred by him, the world outside seeming to move at a pace that he couldn't keep up with. At a traffic light, Jackson stopped, his eyes unfocused as he stared blankly ahead. It was then that he noticed a figure on the side of the road, a boy. No older than 12, holding a bucket and a rag, wiping down car windows for spare change. His jacket was ragged, barely enough to shield him from the cold. But there was a spark in his eyes, a defiance, a determination that made Jackson pause. The boy approached his car, his eyes meeting Jackson's. "Mister, do you want me to clean your window?" he asked, his voice raspy from the cold. Jackson hesitated, then rolled down the window. Reluctantly, Jackson fumbled in his pocket for his last bit of change, handing it to the boy. "Here, but this is all I've got," he muttered. The boy looked at the money and then back at Jackson, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, but I won't have enough change with that," he said, his voice strangely calm. "It won't help me anymore." Jackson was about to drive off when the boy suddenly spoke again, his words catching Jackson off guard. "Hey, mister, I know how to save your company." Jackson froze, stunned by what he had just heard. The absurdity of it hit him in waves. How could this street kid, a boy no older than 12, possibly know anything about his company? Jackson's mind raced, and for a brief moment, the chaos of his life seemed to stop. Jackson couldn't believe his ears. He stared at the boy, his hand still frozen on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The wind howled outside, but all he could focus on was the boy's calm demeanor, his words hanging in the air like a strange riddle. "I know how to save your company," the boy had said so confidently, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. "What did you just say?" Jackson asked, his voice shaky with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. The boy's gaze was steady, almost as if he had expected this reaction. And there was something in his eyes, a spark of understanding. Like he had seen Jackson before or knew something deep about him. "I know how to help you," the boy repeated, his voice unwavering. Jackson blinked, still trying to process. "How could you possibly know anything about my company?" he asked, his irritation starting to edge in. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into another wild goose chase. But then, something about the boy's unshaken certainty piqued his interest. The boy shrugged and pointed toward the downtown area. "Isn't your company just around the corner? I've seen it. You're Jackson Davis, right?" Jackson's heart skipped a beat. How could this kid know his name? He looked at the boy for a long moment, trying to gauge whether he was joking or simply misguided. But there was no hint of mischief in the boy's face, just a calm, determined look. Jackson felt a strange pull in his gut, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected encounter could be the turning point he so desperately needed. He didn't have much to lose, after all, so, after a brief pause, he rolled down the window completely, leaning slightly toward the boy. "All right, kid, How do you know so much about me? And what is it you think you can do? The boy hesitated for a moment, clearly gathering his thoughts. Before speaking again, you need to double-check the documents from your last project. You've been missing something, and I think I can help you find it. Jackson frowned, now more intrigued than ever. Documents? What do you know about the project? He studied the boy's face, trying to read the subtle signs of deceit. But the boy simply met his gaze, unwavering. Don't you recognize me? The boy asked, his eyes searching Jackson's face with an intensity that made him pause. No, Jackson replied flatly. Should I? The boy's expression softened for a second. My name is Lucas. My mom used to work for you as an accountant. Her name's Emily Parker. At the mention of the name, Jackson's entire body went still. Emily. He hadn't heard that name in years. Emily Parker had been one of his top employees, smart, diligent, and hardworking. But that was before the scandal. The financial reports, the accusations, the betrayal. Jackson had trusted his assistant, Ryan, who had convinced him that Emily was guilty of embezzling funds, a crime she had adamantly denied. Jackson's heart sank as he remembered the day Emily had walked out of his office, her head held high as she carried a box with her personal belongings. He had believed Ryan. He had fired Emily without giving her a chance to explain. And now, all these years later, her son stood before him, claiming that he could help save the company she had once worked for. Lucas continued, oblivious to Jackson's shock. She always said you were set up. But no one listened to her. She tried to find the truth, but they wouldn't let her. I think she could help you now. Jackson's thoughts raced. Could Emily really have been right all along? Could Ryan have framed her, setting her up to cover up his own schemes? Jackson didn't know. He didn't have all the answers. But he had to try. For his company, for everything he had worked so hard for. Jackson took a deep breath, steeling himself. You think she could help me? Do you think she can fix this mess? Lucas nodded. I'm sure she can. You should call her. Jackson stared at the boy, the wheels in his mind turning faster now. He couldn't believe he was considering this, taking advice from a street kid who had just appeared out of nowhere. But the boy's words had an undeniable weight to them. And Emily Parker, if she had truly been framed, if she knew something that could bring down Ryan, maybe, just maybe, she was the key to saving everything. All right, Jackson said, his voice firm. Wait here. He threw on his turn signal and pulled the car to the side of the road. Parking by the curb, he motioned for Lucas to wait as he stepped out of the car. The boy looked at him expectantly. But Jackson had one goal in mind. He needed to call Emily. He needed to reach out to the woman he had wronged so many years ago. He wasn't sure how this would go. But the desperation in his heart pushed him forward. Jackson walked to the payphone nearby, fumbling for a coin before dialing the number Lucas had given him. His pulse quickened as the phone rang. He wasn't sure what to expect, what Emily would say to him after all this time. But his mind was set. He had to try. The phone rang again. And then, finally, he heard her voice on the other end. Hello? Emily's voice was colder than he remembered. But it was still familiar. Emily? Jackson said, his voice slightly hoarse. This is Jackson Davis. I need to talk to you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jackson could practically hear Emily's mind racing. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure how she'd react. But finally, she spoke again, her voice guarded. I don't know what this is about, Jackson, she said, her tone sharp. But we have nothing left to talk about. But Jackson wasn't about to give up. Not now, please. Emily, just hear me out. I think you were right. I think you were set up. And I think I need your help. I'm sorry for what happened. For how I treated you. I should have listened. But now, I'm desperate. My company, it's failing. And I need you. There was a silence on the other end. And Jackson held his breath. He wasn't sure how long it lasted. But when Emily finally spoke again, her voice was softer, reluctant even. All right, Jackson, I'll meet with you. But only for one reason. You need to fix what you've done. You owe me that. Jackson let out a shaky breath. Thank you, Emily. I won't let you down. The day of the meeting with Emily arrived sooner than Jackson had expected. And with it came a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had made his way to a small cafe on the edge of the city. A quiet place where the world didn't seem to press so heavily on his shoulders. His thoughts kept returning to the phone call with Emily, her coldness, her guarded tone, the years of silence between them. How could he have been so blind, so eager to trust the wrong person, when someone like Emily had been right all along? As Jackson sat at the small wooden table, sipping his coffee, he couldn't help but think about the last time he had seen her, how confident and capable she had been. And how, in a single moment, he had allowed everything to crumble. He had trusted Ryan, his assistant, over her, and now, here he was, desperately hoping she would be willing to help him salvage what was left. When the door to the cafe opened, Jackson's heart skipped a beat. There she was, Emily. She was different, though. There was a hardness to her now, a strength that had been absent the last time they spoke. Her hair was neatly tied back, her posture straight, and she walked toward him with purpose. Jackson stood up, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. She had always been the first to arrive at work, the last to leave, the best accountant he had ever known. And yet, he had let her go so easily. Emily, Jackson said, his voice quiet as she approached the table. She gave him a brief nod but didn't extend her hand. And that was all he needed to understand that this meeting wasn't going to be an easy one. I wasn't expecting to hear from you, Emily replied, her voice calm but distant. She sat down across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. What do you want, Jackson? The question stung, but he had no time to be sensitive about it. I know you were set up. I should have listened to you. But I didn't. I trusted the wrong person. I need your help, Emily. My company is falling apart. And it's not just the creditors. Someone's been stealing from me. Someone close to me. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Jackson could see the tension in her posture, as if she were trying to decide if he was sincere or just desperate. He had never been good at reading her. But today, it was different. Today, he wasn't the confident businessman with all the answers. Today, he was a man who had lost everything. And she was his last hope. I don't know if I can help you, Jackson, Emily said slowly, her eyes searching his face. I've been away from all of this for years. I've had to rebuild my life, too. But I do know one thing. Someone's been setting you up. And that someone is your assistant, Ryan. Jackson felt a cold chill run through him at the mention of Ryan's name. He had never suspected his trusted assistant of any wrongdoing. But now, hearing Emily's words, the pieces began to fall into place. Ryan had always been too eager, too quick to cover up mistakes, too quick to throw people under the bus. Jackson had trusted him, but that trust now seemed misplaced. You're sure? Jackson asked, his voice trembling slightly. Emily nodded. I was the one who caught the discrepancies in the financial reports. I tried to tell you. But you didn't listen. Ryan knew what he was doing. He was transferring large sums through shell accounts, laundering money, covering his tracks. Jackson closed his eyes, his mind racing. He had been so focused on the wrong things, so blinded by ambition and trust that he had overlooked the one person who might have had the answers. Emily had tried to warn him, but he had turned his back on her. I never knew, Jackson whispered, his voice thick with regret. I should have believed you. Emily leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. It's too late for apologies, Jackson, but I'll help you. I'll go through the documents, find the evidence. But this isn't just about fixing the company. It's about fixing the mistakes you've made. I can't do this for you unless you understand that. Jackson met her gaze, feeling a mix of gratitude and guilt. He had no right to ask for her help, no right to expect her to take him back into her world. But he had no choice. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do. Emily nodded, and for the first time in years, Jackson saw a flicker of the woman he had once known, the determined, resourceful woman who had never been afraid to stand up for what was right. She wasn't going to let him off easy. And that was exactly what he needed. I'll need access to the company's financial records. All of them. I'll need everything Ryan's been working on. Emily's voice was calm, authoritative. And Jackson, this is going to take time. You need to be patient. Jackson nodded. I'll get you everything you need. As Emily rose to leave, she paused for a moment, looking at him with something close to pity. Don't think you can just walk away from this. Jackson, you've got a lot of work ahead of you. And not just with the company. Jackson watched her leave, feeling a strange sense of hope rising within him. This wasn't just about saving his business anymore. It was about redeeming himself. About fixing the mess he had made. And maybe, just maybe, if he did everything right, he could start to rebuild not just his company, but his life as well. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Jackson. Emily was relentless, diving into the company's records with a precision that astounded him. She found discrepancies that Jackson had missed, hidden transfers, mismatched figures, and documents that didn't add up. Everything was pointing to Ryan. But Emily warned him that they couldn't make any assumptions until they had solid evidence. It was exhausting work, but every time Jackson looked at Emily, he saw the strength and determination in her eyes. And he knew they were getting closer to the truth. But there was something else gnawing at him. Something deeper than just the financial mismanagement. He was beginning to realize the full extent of his failures, not just as a businessman, but as a person. He had trusted the wrong people. He had turned his back on those who truly cared about him. And now, he was faced with the task of rebuilding everything: his company, his reputation, and most importantly, his relationships. One evening, as Jackson sat in his office going through the latest batch of documents Emily had uncovered, his phone rang. It was a call he had been dreading but knew was inevitable. Ryan was finally starting to get nervous. Mr. Davis. Ryan's voice crackled through the speaker, feigning casualness. I've been thinking, maybe we should discuss things. I've noticed some strange activity in the accounts lately. Perhaps we need to clarify a few things before things spiral out of control. Jackson could hear the tension in Ryan's voice, and it made his blood run cold. He had never suspected his assistant, his trusted right hand, could be capable of such treachery. But now, as the pieces started to come together, it was clear that Ryan had been working behind his back for months. Maybe even years. Let's meet, Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. Tomorrow, my office. We need to talk. The next morning, Jackson arrived at the office early, his nerves taut with anticipation. This confrontation had been a long time coming. But he wasn't sure he was ready for the truth. He had been blindsided by his own trust. And the thought of facing Ryan, who had been his confidant for so long, felt like an impossible task. When Ryan walked into his office later that day, Jackson took a deep breath. His former assistant looked the same, confident, polished, and self-assured, but there was a flicker of something different in his eyes now. The mask of calm was slipping, and Jackson could see the panic creeping in. Jackson, Ryan said, his voice smooth but betraying a hint of unease. I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but this isn't what you think it is. Jackson stood up from his desk, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. Cut the crap, Ryan, he said, his voice low but unyielding. I know what you've been doing. You've been stealing from me. You've been funneling money through shell accounts. And you've been using me as a cover for your schemes. Ryan's face twitched for a second, his cool facade faltering. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. You've got it all wrong. No, Ryan, Jackson said, his anger rising now. You've been manipulating me, using my trust to cover your tracks. I've had enough of this. Jackson leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. This ends today. I'll make sure you pay for what you've done. And I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. For a moment, Ryan said nothing. He stood there, his eyes darting around the room, as if calculating his next move. But Jackson didn't give him a chance to speak. He picked up the phone and dialed the police. I'm calling them. Ryan, it's over. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Ryan's face went pale as he realized the extent of what he had done. "You can't do this," he whispered, almost pleading. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Jackson felt a sense of finality wash over him as he set the phone down. "I'm done protecting you, Ryan. You've taken everything from me. And now you'll pay for it." Later that afternoon, Jackson met with Emily again. Her face lit up with a quiet satisfaction as she watched the police escort Ryan out of the building in handcuffs. She had been the one to uncover the truth. The one who had led Jackson to this point. And now, with Ryan out of the picture, there was a glimmer of hope in Jackson's heart. "We did it," Jackson said quietly, almost to himself. Emily gave him a small smile. "This is just the beginning, Jackson. There's still a lot of work to be done. You have to rebuild, and that's not going to be easy." Jackson nodded. He knew she was right. This was only the first step in a much longer journey. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance. He had a chance to redeem himself. To prove that he could rebuild from the ashes. The next few months were a blur. The company slowly began to recover, thanks to the hard work of Emily and the few loyal employees Jackson had left. He had learned so many hard lessons during this time. Lessons he would never forget. Trust had to be earned, not given freely. People could surprise you, both in good ways and bad. And sometimes, the greatest redemption came not from others, but from within. One evening, after a long day at the office, Jackson found himself standing in front of Emily's desk. She had worked tirelessly by his side, helping him put together the pieces of his broken business. There was a new respect between them now, an understanding that had been missing before. "Emily," Jackson said, his voice sincere, "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done. You've saved me, and my company." She looked up at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I didn't do it for you, Jackson. I did it for me. I did it for my son. But I'm glad I could help." There was a pause, and Jackson realized how much she had changed his life, not just in business, but in a deeper, more personal way. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm hoping that one day, you'll believe that I'm different now." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave him a small, knowing smile. "We'll see, Jackson, we'll see." And for the first time in years, Jackson knew that the road ahead was filled with possibilities. It wouldn't be easy, but with Emily by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. He had learned the hard way. But now, he was ready for the future. As the months passed, Jackson's life slowly began to take shape again. His company was not only recovering, but thriving, and Emily had proven to be the key to turning everything around. She wasn't just an exceptional accountant, she had become his rock. His anchor, guiding him through the darkest times with patience and unwavering support. They worked side by side, pushing forward through the challenges, rebuilding what had been lost. Jackson had learned valuable lessons in humility, forgiveness, and the true meaning of trust. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he had a future now, one that he would build carefully, brick by brick. The weight of his former mistakes still lingered in the background, but the lessons they carried were now part of him, lessons that would shape his decisions for years to come. One evening, as Jackson sat at his desk, reviewing the latest success report, he couldn't help but glance over at Emily. She was typing away at her computer, focused as always, but there was a new sense of ease between them. Their partnership had grown beyond the office. It had become something deeper, something real. They shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken promise to continue building together. As he sat back, reflecting on how far they had come, Jackson smiled to himself. This was the start of something new. Not just for his company, but for his life. And with Emily by his side, he felt ready for whatever the future would bring. Thank you for following Jackson's journey. And don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of redemption and transformation.